Welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater, located at the National Archives here in Washington, D.C. And a special welcome to those of you who are watching on our YouTube channel. I'm Tom Nastic, Public Program Producer for the National Archives. And today our series of noontime book lectures continues with The Rise of Germany, 1939 to 1941, the War in the West, with our special guest today, James Holland. Before we get to today's program, I'd like to tell you about a couple of upcoming programs that will be presented in this theater, as well as on our YouTube channel. On Wednesday, November 18th at 7 p.m., we'll present the 11th Annual McGowan Forum on Communications. This year's forum is titled Drawn from the Headlines, Communication and Political Cartoons, and will feature a discussion with award-winning editorial cartoonists David Cyprus, Tom Towles, Jen Sorensen, Keith Knight, and Signe Wilkinson. They will discuss their work, what inspires and motivates political cartoons, and how these cartoons affect the political community and the impact of changing technology. And then on Thursday, December 3rd at 7 p.m., we'll present the final discussion program in conjunction with our current exhibit, Spirited Republic, Alcohol in American History, that's currently on display upstairs in our O'Brien Gallery. Join us for the Drunkometer to Digital Apps, How Technology Changes the Way We Drink, which will examine the history and current research on alcohol monitoring technology. Moderated by Gary Wolf, writer and contributing editor at Wired Magazine and co-founder of Quantified Self. Panelists will include Susan Cheever, author of Drinking in America, Our Secret History. To find out more about these and all of our public programs, please consult our monthly calendar of events in the theater lobby or visit us online at www.archives.gov. James Holland is the author of the best-selling Fortress Malta, Battle of Britain, and Dam Busters, as well as numerous works of historical fiction. Holland regularly appears on television and radio and has written and presented the BAFTA shortlisted documentaries Battle of Britain and Dam Busters for the BBC, among others. A fellow of the Royal Historical Society, he has his own collection at the Imperial War Museum. Following his talk and Q&A, he will be signing copies of his book, One Level Up, outside the Archives store. Please help me in welcoming James Holland to the National Archives.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all very much for coming on this lovely November afternoon. I don't think I've ever been in such an impressive National Archives building. I've been to many archives all around the world, but none beats this. I mean, the facade is absolutely extraordinary. Whereas the one in London, for example, down in Kew, fantastic archive though it is a bit like the one up at College Park. It's all kind of sort of modern and looking more like a sort of university campus. It's very functional, but doesn't have that kind of sort of air of splendor about it. World War II, I've been kind of studying this subject for around, about 15 years now, and what a fascinating, endlessly fascinating, and nuanced subject it is. My poor long-suffering wife always says to me, gosh, you've been studying this kind of almost 3 times longer than it actually took place back in the sort of 1930s and 40s, and that is, to a certain extent, true. Funny enough, when I was at school and when I was at university, I never studied any 20th century history at all. I did an awful lot of American history, I hasten to add, but nothing to do with World War II. And it wasn't until I was in a cricket match and I was batting, and I suddenly heard this amazing roar nearby, and I glanced across, and there was this wonderful aircraft pirouetting around the sky. And I turned to the umpire and I said, "What on earth's that?" And he said, "That is a Spitfire." And I was smitten. It was love at first sight. And I immediately thought, I've got to go and find out more about this. So I pretty soon, within a week or so, I was up at Duxford, former Battle of Britain fighter station, and home to many Spitfires and Hurricanes and a number of summer air displays. And there they all were, kind of, doing their stuff across the sky. And it was absolutely amazing. I thought, I've got to find out more. So I started writing a novel, actually, set to a backdrop of just before the war in North Africa, but mainly the main events sort of take place over the summer of 1940. And for that, I suddenly realized I needed to do a lot more research, and I started interviewing a number of veterans and civilians and pilots and all sorts, and a whole new world just opened up. I was just in awe of these incredible people. Imagine being 19 or 20 and suddenly finding yourself in a Spitfire over southern England, tussling with Messerschmitts. It was all, very kind of sort of romantic and chilling at the same time. And I've got to say, it's that human drama that human experience of war that kind of sort of first drew me to the subject. And I've been very lucky in that in the ensuing years I've managed to interview veterans from the war from all around the world, from obviously in Britain, from the United States, from Germany, Wehrmacht types, SS types, from South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, India. Gosh, I've even interviewed Maori warriors. It's been a hell of a journey and fascinating and a great privilege. But the more you get into the subject, the more you kind of realize that this is detective work, and you've got a jigsaw puzzle in front of you, and there's lots of pieces missing, and you kind of just want to find more. It just sucks you in. And it's that kind of detective work, it's that kind of wanting to know more that really drives you forward. And over the years, my views on the war and what really happened and the form it took and the key moments and those key features of the war have sort of subtly changed. But I guess my kind of big Damascene moment was probably about 8 years ago when, in fact, I just embarked on a new series of novels. And this featured a kind of sort of a single hero, a British rifleman going through a kind of classic British line regiment, and it goes from Norway, the kind of the fjords and mountains of Norway, to the deserts of North Africa, to the islands of the Mediterranean, and so on. It's a bit like, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Bernard Cornwell novels, but it's that kind of thing, but set in World War II. And I realized that while my overview of the Second World War, World War II, was pretty good, what I didn't understand was the nuts and bolts. I'd interviewed lots of people, and they told me about eating bully beef or K rations. They told me about what it's like being in a Mustang or a Sherman tank or in a foxhole or whatever. But what I didn't know was, how does that all fit together? How does it work? What is a fighting patrol? What does that actually mean? What do you do? How many men? What are the uniforms they're wearing? What are you actually eating? How often is it? How's it got to the front? All those little things. And I suddenly realized I really needed to kind of up my game on that. And I needed to know that minutiae. I need to be able to kind of feel a rifle in my hand. I need to know what it felt like, what the trigger felt like as you squeezed your finger around that little curve of metal, and so on. And so one of the first things I did was I went to this amazing institution in the UK. We've got a joint combined services staff college at a place called Shrivenham, which is just outside Swindon. It's in Wiltshire, in sort of southwest England. And there they have the Small Arms Unit. Now, the Small Arms Unit is run by a rather splendid fellow called Lieutenant Colonel John Starling, retired. He's former Royal Army Service Corps, as it was back then, now the Logistic Corps. And in there, he's got this incredible arsenal of weaponry going right back from the sort of Black Bess, Baker rifle, right up to sort of AK-47s and current assault rifles and all the rest of it. But as you can imagine, he's got a pretty impressive arsenal of World War II kit as well. And as we were kind of walking past a sort of series of machine guns, I glanced down and I saw a German MG42, known to the Allies as a Spandau. And I went, well, of course, that's the MG42, the preeminent small arms weapon of World War II. And he just turned round at me and just went, says who? Says who? And rather aghast, I kind of sort of stood back and thought, oh dear, I've just made the sort of classic faux pas, and I've only been here kind of 5 minutes. And he then proceeded to kind of deconstruct why Hitler's buzzsaw, as it was known, was not necessarily the best small arms weapon of the Second World War. It depended on what you judged it, and so on. And he pointed out that it was incredibly expensive to build. It took a huge amount of man-hours, 75, and the MG34 took 150. It was hugely expensive. It was over-engineered. Every weapon came with 6 spare barrels. 6 spare barrels, which those crews, those infantrymen, those what we would call you would call a squad, I'd call a section, the Germans would call a grouper, had to carry 6 spare barrels, each of which had a kind of minimum of around 6 inspection stamps, and some many more than that. This is total war. I mean, what are they doing, having all these inspection stamps on it? He said, yes, it's true. It has an amazing rate of fire of some 1,400 rounds per minute, and that's all very impressive. And if you're a kind of fresh-faced GI just come across the Atlantic and you just find yourself in a hedgerow somewhere in Normandy, that's pretty scary. He accepted that. But he said that comes with all sorts of problems as well, because the more bullets you fire, the more ammunition you have to carry. The more bullets you fire, the quicker the barrel heats up. There isn't a wooden handle on it to undo it. You have to unclip it. A kind of red-hot, white-hot barrel flings out seconds away from you, moments away from your face. It comes with all sorts of problems. And finally, a couple of years ago, I had a chance to fire some of these weapons. I fired a British Bren gun, an American .30 caliber M1919 and the MG42. And this was a big moment for me because, I've been writing about this stuff, reading about this stuff, seeing this stuff on films, and here I was lying on the ground, finally getting my chance to feel what it was like to fire these weapons, these iconic, infamous weapons as well. Anyway, the Bren was great, just absolutely nailed it. M1919, not a problem at all. It was on it was on its kind of sort of bipod, and it was just on its little stand it had, and it was just fantastic. Just drilled that target. Admittedly, it was only 25 yards away, but it was a very small target, and I was feeling quite pleased with myself. And then finally, I got down behind the MG42, and I thought, okay, this is it. What's it going to be like? Finally, I'm going to have this experience. And I squeezed the trigger, and this thing just went. It was absolutely insane. It was a beast. It was totally out of control. There was smoke everywhere. And of course, that was one thing I hadn't considered. That if you're firing at kind of 1,500 rounds a minute, each one of those bullets, 12 a second, is firing a little kind of charge, and out of that comes smoke. And within seconds, I could really not see very much at all. And I've got to say, my pattern was all over the place. It was woeful. And so this was a very, very instructive point. And it made me realize that so much of what we understand about World War II is presumed knowledge. And because it's kind of got this weight, you read it in one book, so you repeat it in another book or in another documentary or whatever, and then someone else says it. And after a while, it's been said so often that it becomes a kind of weird sort of truth. When in actual fact, when you start stripping it back, it isn't. I've sort of befriended a rather amazing guy called Nicholas Moran. He's known as the Chieftain, and he's the chief historian for America Wargaming. And he's a very interesting guy because while the actual wargaming is, they try and make it as accurate as they possibly can, but of course it can't be that accurate because it's a war game. But what they also do is they have on their websites, they have all sorts of backup. And of course, Nick has got this most incredible budget for research that you could possibly imagine, way more than any academic would ever be given. And he gets this budget to go around the world kind of finding out all this stuff. And he's fascinating to talk to because, fortunately, he kind of rather agrees with my take on all this, that there's sort of huge parts of the war and our understanding of World War II, particularly when it comes to sort of weaponry and the economics of it and how it all fits together, that is just completely missed out. And of course, he's doing this valuable work. And what it proves, of course, is that yes, there's been godzillion numbers of books and documentaries and films on World War II, but still, 70, 75 years on, there's still so much to learn. It's such a massive subject. And I promise you, if you ever go up to College Park and you look at the stacks of archives there, or you're in the German military archives in Freiburg and you're wading through kind of this amount of notes with swastikas stamped on it and all the rest of it, you suddenly realize that you're just sort of scraping the tip of the iceberg. And talking of scraping the tips of the iceberg, I've got literally another 25 minutes to talk to you today, and this is a massive subject, and I'm only getting to the halfway through 1941. And so what I'm going to do today is just sort of give you some themes, some thoughts. It's going to be less about the human drama today, I'm afraid, but I can very happily answer any questions about that afterwards. But it's going to give you some things which I hope perhaps you might not have considered, or perhaps will just make you think of the things in a different way. When we think of Germany, let's start with Germany. When you think of Germany in World War II, and particularly those early years, the Blitzkrieg years, and I should add, by the way, that Blitzkrieg is a catchphrase, not a doctrine. It was current in the 1930s in Germany, but the person who actually sort of made it current parlance was an American journalist writing about it after the fall of Poland. But when you think of those early years, and let's just stick with Blitzkrieg because we all know what we're talking about, it's that kind of image. It's tanks, it's half-tanks, it's mechanization. But in actual fact, Germany wasn't as mechanized as people think it was. And I think the one thing that's really important about our understanding of World War II is to understand the three levels on which war is understood to be fought. So at the top level, you've got the strategic level. Now, the strategic level means big picture stuff. It's overview. It's overall aims. It's Hitler wanting to invade Britain or the Soviet Union. It's the Allies wanting to make a straight line to Berlin. It's that big pitch. It's Roosevelt, it's Churchill, it's Stalin, it's Hitler, it's the senior generals. Then you've got the tactical level. Now, the tactical means the coalface, the battle, bloke in Spitfire, chap in Sherman, GI in Foxhole, whatever it might be. It's that battle. It's the actual clash of arms, the coalface of war. The third level is the operational level. Now, the operational level is the level that binds the other two. So it's the nuts and bolts, it's the economics, it's the logistics. And because people think this stuff is boring, they tend to leave it out of the book. So your big narrative history, lots and lots of stuff about Montgomery and Patton and Roosevelt and Churchill and all that kind of stuff, and Eisenhower, and lots of stuff about blokes on the front line, Band of Brothers and all the rest of it. But how does that all work? Where do those tanks come from? How are they fed? What about hospitals? What about, how do they get all those Hershey bars and gum and Camels and Lucky Strikes to those troops at the front? How do they get their replacement tanks? What happens if the transmission fails in your Sherman? Who repairs that? All that stuff. And once you understand that level, a whole different picture emerges. And so suddenly you kind of look at that picture and you go, actually, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper here. I want to look a little bit behind this. Is that really true? Is that what it was like? Is our image of Germany in the Blitzkrieg years in 1939 to 1941, is that image of endless panzers, is that the correct one? And the truth is, no, it isn't. It's really startling, but it isn't. And let me give you some stats on this. So in 1939, on the eve of the Second World War, Germany was actually, despite having Mercedes, despite having Audi, despite even having Volkswagen, and Autobahns, they were one of the least automotive societies in the Western world. There were 47 Germans for every mechanized vehicle in Germany on the eve of war. 47. That figure was around 90 in Italy. It was kind of off the radar, off the Richter scale in the Soviet Union. But in Britain, that figure was 14. So Britain, 3 times more automotive than Germany. That figure was 9 in France. So France was the most automotive society in Western Europe, and you just think about those old black Citroens. I've actually got one that's sort of been around. That's why it all starts to make sense when you think about it. You think about the Germans and the Gestapo driving around in those black Citroens in France in the war years. They're doing that because they don't have the cars themselves, but the French have got lots of them, so they nick them. So that all starts to, you think, yeah, okay, that starts to make sense here. And then, of course, there's America. Well, that figure is 4. I mean, perhaps no surprise. You're thinking Henry Ford, you're thinking, General Motors and all the rest of it. So maybe you'd expect that. But there's a problem, because if you're not a very automotive society, that means you haven't got a huge amount of factories building cars. And if you haven't got a huge amount of factories building cars, you haven't got a huge amount of garages to repair them. And if you haven't got a huge amount of garages to repair them, you don't need a huge amount of gas stations. And if you don't have a lot of gas stations, you don't have a lot of people who know how to drive them in the first place. So you can't just click your fingers and suddenly become mechanized. So what Germany does is actually created a huge, huge footprint of army, a massive, very heavy, manpower-heavy armed forces, in which most of them are not getting about like this. Most of them are getting about on horses and on their own 2 feet. The other thing when we think about Germany in those early days of the war is dive bombers. We think of Stukas, those banshee wails of the Jericho trumpets underneath. You can see at the front underneath the fuselage, screaming down on Warsaw, on Rotterdam, on those columns of refugees fleeing from Belgium and France. That's what you're thinking about. Well, the principles behind dive bombing make all really good sense, because what you're going to do is if you can dive bomb, that means you can be more accurate. And of course, bombing accuracy in the early part of the war is not great, because there's no GPS, there's no laser guided or anything like that. You basically just, it's pretty primitive. There's no Norden bomb site for the Germans. So the closer you can get, the more accurate you can be. The more accurate you can be, the less bombs you need. The less bombs you need, the less aircraft you need to deliver them. That's the principle behind it. And it works to start off with. It works if you control the airspace yourself. And of course, in the Blitzkrieg years against Poland, in Norway, in the West, the Luftwaffe are running the route, holding all the aces, because they can decide where to concentrate their forces, because none of those countries that they're fighting have an air defense system. There is sort of primitive radar in France, but they're not really using it. So the defenders don't know when the Luftwaffe are going to attack. So the Luftwaffe can form up en masse, Messerschmitts up ahead, protecting the airspace, Stukas dive bombing. It's happy days. And of course, a lot of those targets are fixed. There's a big factory on the ground, there's marshalling yards or whatever. Great, there's no problem hitting those. But suddenly cracks start to appear, because at Dunkirk, for example, when the British are all evacuating, they're all evacuating into ships, and even a Stuka dive bomber, when it begins its dive from 6,000 feet, releases it at kind of, 1,500 feet or whatever, that destroyer crammed full of British and French troops still looks like a pencil. It's tiny, and it's wobbling about all over the place. And to make things worse, there's Spitfires and Hurricanes waiting, and as that Stuka comes out of its dive, it's almost at a standstill. and they get slaughtered, which is one of the reasons why the British and a large number of Frenchmen are able to escape from Dunkirk. The problem is that the Germans have already backed dive bombing to the hilt. So the new generation of medium bombers, the Junker 88, that's been given dive bombing capabilities too. It's not designed for that initially, but the Luftwaffe General Staff are insisting upon it. Then, even more crazily, they go, well, we're going to build a 4-engine bomber, and let's give that dive bombing capabilities too. So they create the Heinkel 177, and it's a total turkey. It's an absolute dog of a plane. It completely doesn't work. And of course, I'm not an aeronautical engineer, but it doesn't take, you don't need to be kind of Barnes-Wallis or something to realize that, or even Willie Messerschmitt, to realize that a 4-engine bomber is just simply not going to be able to dive bomb. It's too big, it's too heavy, it's just it's a total waste of time. And in the process, the whole production, the procurement process takes too long. It sets them back. It costs them vast amounts of money. They lose lots of brilliant test pilots in the process who are killed trying to get this dog up and running. So yes, the Luftwaffe is amazing. It's the best air force in the world in 1939 and the first part of 1940, definitely. Well, throughout the whole of 1940, it's the biggest air force. But there are cracks there already, and this is what I mean by kind of sort of slightly unpicking some of this stuff. It's also important to realize that, just how under-mechanized the Germans were. This photograph, believe it or not, is taken in June 1940, and it's a German artillery unit, having watering its horses and cleaning up and stuff. But if I told you that was taken in, somewhere in Europe in about 1886, I doubt very many of you would have questioned that. It's amazing how old-fashioned it looks. And the truth of the matter is, of the 135 divisions that the Germans used in the Blitzkrieg in the West in May 1940, only 16 of them are motorized. And of those 16, only 10 are Panzer divisions. Panzer divisions are brilliant. They're amazing. They're the most advanced of all the armoured divisions in the world at the time. The British have them, the French have them, but they're just stuffed full of tanks. What the Germans realise is that actually what you want is all arms. So a Panzer division is made up of, yes, of tanks, but also motorised infantry and also motorised artillery. And that is the spearhead. It is the shining point of that spear, whereas the infantry and much of the artillery that is following behind is very much the wooden shaft. And the key is to make that point really, really count. And that's where it's important to understand the German way of war. Now, Germans don't understand the concepts of Austrotaktik, which is completely overused in staff colleges around the world, and particularly in America and Britain. And they don't understand concepts of Blitzkrieg. What they do understand is the concept of Bewegungskrieg. And Bewegungskrieg is the operational art of maneuver. And it's really important that the Germans do this, because what they're trying to do is hit wherever they attack, they do so with a massive weight of force. It's called the Schwerpunkt, the main point of attack. And what they do is they usually do it in 2 attacks, and they do a huge battle of encirclement. It's called the Kesselschlacht, the cauldron war, because you create what looks like a cauldron. And it's a war of annihilation. And the reason they do this is because Germany is stuck in the middle of Europe. It's vulnerable from all sides. It's got very small amount of access to the world's oceans, which you need for supplies. And it itself is very resource poor. It doesn't have huge resources of iron ore, for example. It's got a little bit of coal. It doesn't have any resources, supplies of oil or bauxite or copper or any of these things that you need for a long, protracted war. So the whole way the Germans do things is short, sharp, quick, and to the point. And it has to be a war of annihilation. So the moment they cross the border in Poland, on the 1st of September 1939, they have embarked on a war which can only be total war. It can only be a complete war of annihilation of all the enemies they come up with. Nothing else will do. No, it can't be kind of a stalemate. It can't be winning a few battles. It's got to be complete annihilation of your enemies. Because otherwise, the war is going to drag on. And if the war drags on, they're just not going to be able to keep up with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world, and I'm talking about Britain, France to a certain extent, but America and others, have much greater access to the world's resources than they do, which is why Poland needs to be all over in a fortnight, give or take. It's why France needs to be defeated in 6 weeks, and it's why when Britain doesn't come to the peace table following the fall of France, this is bad news for Germany, because it's suddenly facing a much more long and drawn-out war, and that is a problem. So what about Britain? Well, there is an image of Britain, I think, and I know this from kind of personal experience. We like in Britain, or have done in the last few last few decades, to kind of rather rubbish our performance. And I think this all ties in with this sort of idea that somehow we're little Britain. We can't imagine that once we had the world's largest empire. You know, there was sort of post-empire guilt, then there was decline of Britain as a great power. Our influence has shrunk. We're just this tiny island. We don't have these vast overseas possessions anymore. America has grown up. The Soviet Union had, now it's China. You know, we're being kind of dwarfed. And people just can't imagine that once we were the preeminent global superpower. It just seems sort of impossible. And so after the kind of sort of the gung-ho war movies that we were producing immediately after the war, you know, I'm thinking Dam Busters, 633 Squadron, and so on and so forth, you know, suddenly it started to be a bit more kind of rubbishy. And, you know, you look at kind of American films, any chance to kind of twist the knife on the kind of sort of rather pathetic Tommies was always taken. And, you know, it's fine, I'm over it now. But in actual fact, you know, again, a kind of different opinion about Britain, a different kind of perspective needs to be taken. And there is this image of us being sort of backs to the walls amateurs, kind of David against Goliath, sort of, you know, fighting by the skin of our teeth against this huge military Moloch. But actually, it's just not true. It's very, very misleading. And I think what has to be realized is just the scale of Britain's global reach in 1940, you know, in June 1940, when France has fallen. And, you know, it has to be remembered that we're an island nation. You know, we hadn't built up a huge army for a very good reason, because if you have a huge army, you have to have conscription. And British society in the 1930s, a progressive, liberal, democratic nation, simply would not have put up with conscription in the late 1930s. And when Chamberlain, the Prime Minister at the start of the war, introduces it in March 1939, you know, he's really nervous there's going to be a huge outcry. There isn't, as it happens. But it just underlines how difficult it is to create a large army. Even if you do have a large army, what are you going to do with it when you're an island nation? You're only going to get it from A to B by shipping. Well, that shipping is needed. That naval forces are needed to supply Britain and the empire and to protect our huge merchant shipping fleet. So you don't want to be using that to moving troops all over the place. And on top of that, we have an ally in France, and France has got one of the world's largest armies, or potential to have the world's largest army. It has a, you know, you compulsorily have to join the armed forces in France. You then have to, you do your bit, then you're on a reserve list, then you're on a secondary reserve list, and all the rest of it. And literally within 48 hours of pressing the go button, all those reservists can be called up, and you've got an army of 3 million. And so there was no point in Britain doing that. We've got the world's largest navy. It's why it's called the senior service. We have the world's largest merchant shipping navy, some 33%. And Britain has access in the Second World War, in World War II, to around 80 to 85% of the world's merchant shipping. Now, that is really, really good news in a long, drawn-out war, because that means unless that shipping is taken away from you, and 80-85% of the world shipping is unlikely to be taken away from you, you're going to be in pretty good order to get the supplies you need. And then look at this. So the empire is the bits in pink, stroke red, but look at the bits which aren't in the empire. Isn't that line of ants going down to Argentina, for example, interesting? So Britain owns quite a large part of Argentina. Argentina is not part of the British Empire, but it is, you know, the railway network is owned by British business. Most of the port facilities are owned by British businesses. Much of the farms, those big beef farms, they're owned by British businesses. And you can see the amount of trade beetling back. And just think about oil, that really key ingredient for warfare. You know, where's that coming from? You know, most people think that the Middle East is really important. Iraq, Persia, Iran now as it is. You know, but it isn't. Not in the World War II times it isn't. The most important and biggest manufacturer of oil, of course, is the United States of America. The second biggest is Venezuela. Baku in Azerbaijan and Soviet Union, that's sort of languishing quite a long way back in third. Middle East doesn't sort of, you know, barely break sweat on that scale. And Romania, which is the main supplier for Germany after the 27th of May, hardly anything at all. So, you know, it's all the right side of the Atlantic, and we've got that kind of shipping. And that's why it's so important. And what Churchill realizes, he's new to being Prime Minister, takes over as Prime Minister on the 10th of May, the day that the Germans launched the Blitzkrieg in the West. You know, what he realizes is that actually Britain's in pretty good place. As long as we can hang on. And, you know, our very, very small army of 10 divisions, compare that with the 105 French, 20 Belgian and Dutch, 135 German involved in the battle for France and the Low Countries, just 10. Losing that is a humiliation, it's a loss of face, it's very embarrassing, it's tragic, it's all those things, but it's hardly kind of, it's not bringing us to our knees by any stretch of the imagination. And actually, Britain as a manufacturer is pretty impressive as well. The factories are churning out. By the middle of the Battle of Britain, we're producing way more planes than the Germans are, for example, and indeed tanks by the end of 1940, and indeed ships and ammunition and rifles and all the rest of it. And it's really interesting. If you look at that, the production of single-engine fighters, and single-engine fighters are key to the Battle of Britain, both for defense and for protecting your bombers if you're the attackers. Britain produces 497 Spitfires and Hurricanes in July 1940, whereas Germany only produces 237 single-engine Messerschmitt 109s, which is the only single-engine fighter they've got at the time. So that's less than half, and that's a ratio that does not improve at any point in 1940. So at the beginning of the Battle of Britain, beginning of July 1940, Britain's got around kind of 640, something like that, Spitfires and Hurricanes, and Germany has, the Luftwaffe has around 760 or something. By the end of October, when the Battle of Britain is considered to have drawn to a close, Britain has around 780 Spitfires and Hurricanes, so pretty much the same number that Germany started off with, whereas Germany's got about 175. So, well and truly beaten. And it's not sort of pilot shortage that the Germans are struggling with, it's aircraft production. They're just not as efficient at it. In the whole of the war, Britain produces 132,500 aircraft. Well, I think that's pretty good going for a small country like Britain, when you're doing all the other stuff, including kind of mobile harbours the size of Dover and all the global reach and all the rest of it. America in the war produces 315,000 aircraft. Unbelievable, phenomenal. But of course they've got the factory space, they've got the space, they've got the workforce, they haven't got blackouts and all the rest of it. So I'm just saying, I'm not belittling America's production effort at all. I'm just saying that don't think that Britain is just purely hanging off the shirt tails of the United States. The United States is essential for Allied victory, but it's not essential for Britain staying in the war. And, that's an important distinction. Britain, right up until the moment that America enters the war in December 1941, is basically doing it on her own. Yes, getting some supplies from America, but as I'm about to explain, not as many as you might think in those early years. And the other thing, of course, is that, the Germans just don't have enough planes to destroy Britain either. I mean, I've read just this year, in this 75th anniversary year of the Battle of Britain, you still see newspaper articles in the UK where it says, RAF were the last line of defense against the Nazi hordes and all this kind of guff. And it's just absolute balls. I mean, RAF was the front line of defense, not the last line of defense, because after that you've got a pretty sizable army. You've got 2 million Home Guardsmen by the end of August 1940, plus the army, plus more divisions arriving all the time. Plus you've got an English Channel which is absolutely just riddled with mines. Then you've got the world's largest navy, and you've got a fully coordinated air defense system surrounding Britain. It's quite a long way off from Germany being in a position to invade, and there's absolutely no way you can do a seaborne invasion unless you've got control of the airspace, and they don't come close to achieving that. So, it's a long way off. And just think about D-Day in June 1944. Just think about the jeopardy that was involved in D-Day. Think how nervous Ike was as he paced around in the kind of rain-sodden early hours of kind of, the 4th of June, wondering whether to make that call, thinking, are we going to be able to make it? Think about that when you think of the huge dominance we had at sea, when you think about the huge dominance we had in the air, you think about the fact that we had landing craft and landing shifts and the huge intelligence advantage as well. Think about how much we had in our favor, and still it seemed a mission fraught with danger and jeopardy. And then think about the Germans in 1940. They don't have control of the seas, they don't have control of the airspace, they don't have any landing craft, their intelligence is absolutely woeful. You cannot tell me that the Germans had a chance of getting across the Channel. On top of that, there were 16 squadrons of bombers within RAF Bomber Command who were all primed and waiting to go with chemical weapons and all sorts of other nasties and flamethrowers and all sorts of things that they were going to pour onto any invasion force that tried to get across the Channel. I'm sorry, it just wasn't going to happen. And then you look at things like an airfield such as Hawkinge in southern England, and you realise that this place is about 100 acres in size. It's grass. And, your 20 bombers that are coming over, they're dropping equivalent of about 30 tons of bombs. Now, 30 tons of bombs, it's just not enough. It creates lots of potholes. But, the British have thought of that. They've got, around the side, they've got bulldozers and piles of scalpings and so on, and they just fill them in again. And I remember talking to Tom Neal, who flew with 249 Squadron. On the 3rd of September, anniversary of the outbreak of Britain's war, he took off from North Weald in his Hurricane with 11 other Hurricanes, and no sooner had they done so than North Weald came under attack and the whole airfield disappeared under clouds and balls of smoke and dust and grit and all the rest of it as the Dorniers came over and dropped their polos. And he thought, oh my God, how am I ever going to get back down again? And I said, well, obviously you did, because you're still here, Tom. He said, oh, yes, actually, we all did. And I said, well, how did you manage that? He said, oh, it's easy. We just dodged the potholes. And, of course, this is the point. And this is why, in the whole of the Battle of Britain, only one airfield was knocked out for more than 24 hours. One in the whole of Britain. They were just so far off from winning the Luftwaffe. It's not true. And it's very much part of the kind of British myth that it was kind of, did it by a kind of, a hair's breadth and that it was a close-run thing and all the rest of it. It wasn't a close-run thing. And the reason it wasn't a close-run thing was because Britain was really well organised, really well prepared, made absolutely the most of its assets. That radar chain, the observer corps, high-frequency direction finding, ground controllers, all this kind of stuff. Together, collectively, all those bits, and an amazing intelligence picture as well, I should add, collectively, they add up to much more than the sum of their individual parts. And the Germans have just never come up against anything like this, and frankly, they don't have a chance. It is Britain's finest hour, in my humble opinion. It is a great turning point in the battle in the Second World War. It's the thing that makes Hitler realize that the war is going on. It forces him to fight a war on two fronts, which is kind of the worst nightmare of every kind of red-blooded German. It forces him to turn east to the Soviet Union before he's ready. Etc., etc. So although the number of people involved is not very important, strategically, operationally, and tactically, Battle of Britain is a key moment. And what about America then? Finally, let me do some thoughts on this. Well, I think this is just the most amazing story. And let me start right now by saying that by 1945, the American armed forces are the best in the world, bar none. There is no one to touch them. And what they do in World War II is just phenomenal. Those 50,000 aircraft a year, the kind of 315,000 aircraft a year. Just think 315,000. I mean, I don't know how big your big sports stadiums are, but if I think about Wembley, Wembley's about 80,000, something like that. A whole of Wembley times 3.5 or nearly 4. No, 4 times Wembley full of aircraft manufactured in the Second World War. That's amazing. And then add on 800,000 Jeeps, add on 74,000 Sherman hulls, etc., 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 and all the shipping and aircraft carriers that are made. It's absolutely unbelievable. But do not think that America emerges fully formed as the arsenal of democracy somewhere around kind of 1941, because it just isn't like that. And the road to getting in that position where they can produce 50,000, where you guys can produce 50,000 aircraft a year, is an amazing one. And trust me, yes, it's about economics, yes, it's about politics and logistics and supply and all the rest of it, but it is the most incredible story. It's just riddled with amazing human drama, fabulous characters and all the rest of it. And the point, I suppose, is key to all this is Roosevelt. You can't avoid that. I think one of the great advantages that the Western allies have is that in Churchill and Roosevelt, they really do have amazing statesmen. I think in that instance, the myth about World War II is probably correct. Whereas Hitler and Mussolini, they're men with very narrow worldviews. Their geopolitical understanding is very, very small. They're continentalist largely. They don't see that bigger picture. Roosevelt is an arch Machiavellian. He's a really smooth operator. He has vision, he has foresight, and that's what you really need. So much about politics is short-termism. It's kind of up to the next election, to the next, midterm elections or whatever it might be. But what he can see is the long view. And that's so important if you're living through a time which is fraught with all sorts of unknown dangers. And what he realizes from a very early stage, from as early as 1938, when Hitler starts to kind of sort of browbeat and takes Austria and the Anschluss, and then later on in the year starts to move into the Sudetenland, what he realizes is that here is a big problem for the future. Hitler, Nazi Germany, these guys mean business. They're badass, and they need to be sorted out. And unlike many of his fellow Americans, he does not believe that the Atlantic is the great barrier that many people believe it is. He can see that the way technology is changing. He can see that before too long, there will be aircraft that can cross the Atlantic and bomb America. There are submarines that are going to be developed. There are greater, more powerful ships in the offing, aircraft carriers, and so on. And he realizes that if France and Britain fall, if he doesn't sort of act as a bulwark to their own defensive systems, America is going to be vulnerable. And he's got a problem because coming up in 1940 is a presidential election, and he will have done 2 terms. And, it's not thought to be permissible to do a 3rd term. But who can he trust to kind of steer America through these choppy waters? And it's very difficult. And of course, most of Americans is isolationist in instinct. And many of the leading politicians are vehemently isolationist in every single degree. Don't even go there. Don't even think about war. There's a reason why we have a small armed services. And that's because if we have a small armed services, we won't get involved in any wars because you can't, because you haven't got the armed services to do it. Conversely, if you do have large armed services, you always get drawn into wars, as you guys will appreciate from the last sort of 15, 20 years. So, there is a valid logic to that. But Roosevelt is worried, and so what he's been doing ever since 1938 is been trying to wrestle some power from Congress so that when the moment comes, he's in a position to make decisions that don't constantly he doesn't have to constantly revert to other people to get those decisions made. And this is finally passed in April 1940, and it's just genius. It's a hidden and totally forgotten piece of legislation. It is the Administration Reorganization Act. And it sounds really dull and really boring, but actually it's quite an important act in the history of the United States, because what that does is it allows Roosevelt to create the executive office of the president. And within that executive office, what he moves in are a whole number of bureaus and little organizations and institutions which come under his direct control without any recourse to anybody else whatsoever. It's not democratic by any stretch of the imagination, but it's very, very important for what happens in the years to come. So amongst that is the Army Navy Munitions Board. It is the Bureau of the Budget. It is the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And there is also a new specially created office called the Office of Emergency Management. Now, what does that mean? It's just hidden. It's just, we'll also add this one as well into the executive office because of the Administrative Reorganization Act. It's kind of sort of swept under the carpet through the back door without anyone kind of sort of really completely noticing. And he doesn't immediately enact this, but then on the 25th of May, he does. He creates what he calls the National Defense Advisory Commission. And this is really important. Think about it. The 25th of May, it's the day before the Dunkirk operation starts to evacuate British and French troops from Dunkirk. It's when defeat in France is looking absolutely inevitable. It is a moment of crisis in the histories of France, Britain, and in Roosevelt's eyes, the United States as well. And he's got to act. But how is he going to do this? There's this election coming up. There's a huge isolationist sort of movement in the US where people don't want their young men going off to war and fighting in a European war. Lots of people have left Europe just because of that. They've come to America for a better life. They want to leave all that behind. They don't want to get embroiled in some other conflict with a weird-looking guy with a dodgy tash. They kind of, so you can see why he's got this very, very difficult line to tread. But he also realizes that America's armed services, and General Marshall, the chief of the American Army, also realizes, and some other enlightened Americans do, also realize that America is, in terms of defense, incredibly weak. It has an impressive sized navy, but otherwise it's got almost nothing. It's got 74 fighter planes on the eve of war in 1939. 74! I mean, it's nothing. It's got an army which is 19th in the world in September 1939. Just 189,000 men. That is just minuscule by the standards of the day. And so how do you just suddenly build all this up? How do you suddenly create factories that can produce 50,000 aircraft a day? You only do that by preparation. But the preparation has to start now, in May 1940, at this moment of crisis. So what he does is he creates this National Defense Advisory Commission and draws into it businessmen, industrialists, capitalists, people who know about how to make things. He gets Edward R. Stettiner, who's the chairman of the American Steel Corporation. He gets guys like this chap, Bill Knudsen, who is the chairman, the head of General Motors since 1937. And Bill Knudsen's a really interesting guy because he's a Dane. He's come over from Denmark in 1900. He has worked for Henry Ford. He's created the conveyor line. He understands mass production. What he realizes is that you have to keep things simple, that everyone in the chain of production needs to know their role and what they're doing, and everything has to fit. The more complicated it is, the more expensive it is, the more time-consuming it is, the less complex it is, the converse is true. The more simple it is to put together, the cheaper it is to put together because it takes less time. And it's easier to expand as well because the more simple it is, you can people require less skill to make these things. You can create shadow factories, huge willow runs and all the rest of it to produce aircraft parts. And he realizes, and he's applied this to car manufacturing, automobile manufacturing, and Roosevelt realized that this is a man, if they need to go on a kind of massive war footing, this is the man who can achieve this for the United States. And it's put under a kind of advisory commission, but this is, that is disingenuous. It's not an advisory commission. It's not even a commission. This is a department that is, these are people that are operating directly for the president to make things happen, to kind of, again, sweep this through the back door without the political corridors of Washington really kind of smelling a rat. And it takes time, and this is what Knudsen tells Roosevelt. It takes time, because to start off with, you've got to build the machine tools. And the machine tools are very complicated bits of kit that make the bits that then make the aircraft. And that takes around 6 months. Then you've got to train your staff into making, your workers into making these new things, and that's another 6 months. And then you've actually got to start the manufacturing. You've got to switch over from commercial manufacturing, cars and what have you, and washing machines or whatever it might be, and fridges, over to building tanks and aircraft and all the rest of it. And that's another 6 months. And, sorry, I don't know what I've pressed here. Hold on. Sorry, excuse me. You don't really want a picture of this across Bill Knudsen's face. Oops. There we go. Back to normal. And he realizes that this is going to take time. But all those things are put in place, and it is that decision-making process in 1940, plus investment of British money from Churchill, some $50 billion, that enables them to be in a position where, come the start of the war, for America in December 1941, they're in a position to press go. But up until that point, Britain is more or less on its own. Yes, Britain is investing in American shipbuilding. It's getting amazing people like Henry Kaiser to build brand new shipyards out of nothing in kind of, nanoseconds. It is reaping those benefits. And when you look, but slowly, and what is amazing is you go from kind of almost sort of year zero, point zero, for Britain and America in June 1940, and then look at the pictures of Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Look at those amazing photographs of them loading up the ships and landing ships and all the rest of it before they're about to go off to invade Sicily. And you look at the hundreds upon hundreds of Sherman tanks and half-tracks and men and the huge naval forces that have been brought together, and you think about the vast thousands of aircraft and all the rest of it, and you think, from nothing, pretty much, in June 1940 to that just 3 years later, that is unbelievable. The last one I'm going to leave you with is on the eve of Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which is where I end this first volume of my book on the war in the West. And just think about this. So on the eve of Barbarossa, Germany has one enemy, and that's Great Britain. On New Year's Eve, 1941, just 6 months later, she's got three enemies. She's got Great Britain, she's got the Soviet Union, and she's got the United States. Now just look at what those three countries have got on offer. Just think about it. Think about that huge global shipping, that huge amount of resources. Think about the manpower, the space, the manufacturing potential of all those three countries. I cannot see how Germany could ever have won. The only way it was going to win was if it won very, very quickly in the Soviet Union. And as we all know, that didn't happen. Thank you. Are there any questions? There's a microphone, I think, hovering around for people to take if they want to ask a question. No, have I stunned you all into silence?
Could you explain what happened in May of 1939 when Churchill took over? Britain gave serious thought to capitulating, didn't it?
Yeah, May 1940, yes. That's a very good question. Britain's darkest hour, in my opinion, was Monday the 27th of May 1940. It was just 24 hours into when Dunkirk evacuation had begun. It looked like it wasn't going to work. It looked like most of the British Expeditionary Force was going to be left in France. The shock of defeat was total. Everyone was absolutely gobsmacked. They'd gone into the war quietly confident that the combined efforts of Britain and France, with their huge global clout and manufacturing potential and all the rest of it and economic strength, would be enough. The blitzkrieg that the Germans enacted was 50% German brilliance and 50% predominantly French failings. And it all looked terribly bad. And what's really interesting about that episode is that what is prompting it really is a spat within the British War Cabinet. Now, the wider cabinet has about 30 people in it, but the War Cabinet has 5. Has Greenwood and Attlee, who are from Labour, who have just joined on the 10th of May and are new to frontline politics. But it also has 3 very, very experienced men. It has Churchill himself, who's been around since the early part of the century. It has Neville Chamberlain, the former Prime Minister, who's been humiliated with his enforced resignation on the 10th of May 1940. And it has Lord Halifax, who is, without doubt, the most respected man in Britain in terms of politicians. He's an ex-viceroy of India. He's been around the block. He's a man who's known to have a very, very cool head and wise judgment on things. And it is Halifax who is urging Churchill and the War Cabinet to open the door to peace feelers. He can't understand why Churchill won't agree, and he can't see what they've got to lose. What Churchill realises with his great statesmanship and with his much broader geopolitical understanding and geomilitary understanding than Halifax has, is that once you open the door, you've crossed a Rubicon from which you cannot return. And it is a supreme irony to me that Churchill, who is widely regarded as hot-headed, lacking judgment, likes a cigar and a tipple too much and all the rest of it, and he has bad form with Gallipoli, the abdication crisis and the general strike behind him, it is ironic that he is the man at this moment who is showing a calm head and good judgment, whereas Halifax, who is completely the opposite, is the one who is losing his head at that moment. And suffice to say that it is Chamberlain, who is the deposed Prime Minister, who is instinctively much closer allied and indeed a friend of Halifax rather than to Churchill, who sides with Churchill in this. And by the beginning of the 29th of May, 2 days later, the crisis has passed and it's never raised again. And Britain decides to fight on and does so, and it is never ever questioned again. That crisis has gone forever. But that is the closest they come to losing the war.
A comment and a question. The comment refers back to your talk about the weapon systems. Germany's famous for the Tiger tank, but they didn't build very many of them. And so when they went east, they had a big problem because the Russians with their T-27s, they were as common as Sherman tanks, maybe even more. That's what helped win for the Russians at Kursk. But my question about that is, when Paulus surrenders 600,000 Germans after Stalingrad, what was Hitler's thinking? I think his generals already knew before they went over there that this was not the thing to do. And was it 16 or 12 assassination attempts that Scheirer recounted in his book? So they always knew, how did he keep getting away with it? And then the Czechs probably could have held him off if Sudetenland hadn't been given away. Thank you.
You make some excellent points. Let me just go to each in turn. I mean, the first point you make about the Tiger tank, it's not just that the Tiger tank is made in such small numbers. In fact, there's only 1,347 Tigers and 492 King Tigers built. There's 49,000 Shermans and 74,000 Sherman hulls. But it's not just that, it's the simplicity of it. The Germans over-engineer everything, and they just can't help themselves. And it's really interesting. I found this amazing. I had an amazing hallelujah moment a couple of years ago. I was in the German archives, and I came across this document that was signed. It was a kind of verbatim report of a meeting that had taken place on the 4th of December, 1941. So just think about that date. 3 days before the Day of Infamy, and the Germans are suffering a reverse. Outside Moscow. It's snowing, it's cold, it's all going horribly wrong. The war's dragging on into its kind of third winter, blah, blah, blah. And this document is signed by Hitler. There's his ink on the, of his fountain pen on that sheet. And one of the lines right near the top goes, "We have to stop making such complete and aesthetic weapons." It's just amazing. In other words, we've consciously been building complete and aesthetic weapons up until that point. And yet, some years later, in 1943, comes the Tiger tank with its 6-speed, hydraulically controlled, pre-selector gearbox designed by Ferdinand Porsche, which sounds incredibly complicated and is. And you put an 18-year-old rookie tank driver in it, it's going to break. And it does. Of course, if you put a Sherman tank and a Tiger tank opposite each other on a football field, the Tiger's going to win every single time. But it's not as simple as that. There's a reason why Sherman tanks are 30 tons, and that's because, even when you've loaded them up with men and extra ballast and ammunition and supplies and lucky strikes and all the rest of it, it's still under 40 tons. And why does it need to be under 40 tons? Because the most common bridging piece of kit that the Allies have is the Class 40 Bailey Bridge, 40-ton Bailey Bridge, which can't take a 56-ton tank. So you need it because as you're advancing, you're going over broken bridges, and you need to get across these rivers, and that's the way to do it. And of course, they're easy to produce because they're comparatively simple. The gearbox of a Sherman is a simple manual 4-speed going forward, one reverse, and you just whip them out and put another one in, and so on. And the Panther is hurried for Kursk, and it's a dud because the production process has been too hurried. And you can apply this to anything. I brought in my humble gas mask case here, which is my man bag, and it is amazing how, although this was designed in 1937 and this particular model was created in 1942. It is amazing how someone thought to kind of create an easy compartment for an iPad, an iPhone 6, a Moleskine, and all the rest of it. It's just perfect. But the point about that is it's made out of canvas. It's incredibly cheap to manufacture. If it rots and gets wet or the kind of thing breaks, who cares? Just buy another one. What do the Germans have? The Germans have that cylinder. That steel cylinder with its ribs, and it's got a little chain on it, and you spring on it, and you open the lid, and inside is another little lid, and you open that, and it's got a kind of gossamer spring on it, and that's to keep a spare lenses for your gas mask, which you're never going to use. It sits on your back with a lever, not a canvas strap. Think about jackboots. They come all the way up to here. What a waste of time. It's a total waste of money, and it doesn't matter putting all that emphasis on over-engineering and looking sartorially sharp and come on in, the water's warm and get the Fräulein. That doesn't matter if your war lasts 6 weeks, but it's a massive problem if it lasts 6 years. And it's something they just never, ever managed to get beyond. So we always think of, when someone says Teutonic, the next word almost inevitably is efficiency. And I would say Germany in the Second World War, Teutonic inefficiency. They do not make the most of the meager resources they have. God, I've gone on so long now, I can't remember what the second part of your point was. Assassinations, yes. Why? Okay, so Hitler, yes, he is effectively doing that to the German armed forces throughout the Second World War. He thinks he's the greatest general that's ever lived. He was a corporal in the First World War. He's never been to Staff's College. He's skipped a whole number of ranks to be Commander-in-Chief of the German armed forces, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And what happens is he's really lazy. He sort of flabs around in bed till 10 o'clock, then gets up, bores everyone rigid with his bad breath and monologues, goes for a walk, has a cup of tea and a kind of, too much pudding, comes back, has another cup of tea, rants at his generals, then watches Lives of a Bengal Lancer, then has another monologue, then goes to bed. He's absolutely hopeless. So, and in between all that, he then micromanages. So at one point, he's really lazy, doesn't want to do the admin. and doesn't want to get involved. On another level, he then starts getting involved and starts micromanaging everything and unpicking the plans that have been very, very carefully laid. And the only chance the Germans have got is if the right people who know what they're talking about are given the authority and the remit to get on with what they're supposed to be doing. This constant meddling and interfering, reinforcing the Mediterranean every 2 seconds, so on and so forth, and keeping powerless in when, clearly they should have bugged out. It's insane. But, he's got very tight security around him. He's incredibly lucky. That bottle of Cointreau that didn't blow up on the plane, the Stauffenberg's briefcase, crikey, talk about 9 lives. As you say, he's got 16. And it's a great tragedy for the world and for the German people that he wasn't bumped off in very quick order, probably sometime around 1921.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Getting back to one of your principles that you mentioned early on in your lecture, and that was Germans need to have quick lightning strike war that advances quickly because they don't have the supplies or they don't have the natural resources. So when they invaded France and probably to their great surprise were able to advance so quickly, I think you said 6 weeks or 8 weeks, something like that. Why didn't they continue across the channel? It seems so obvious that you're going to have this enemy out there sitting right on top of you. You've sent Western Europe reeling. Why not take that additional step?
Sure.
In the records that you examined, in German records, did they indicate that they did have contingency plans? Thank you.
Yes, the point is the reason they don't go. I'm sorry, I'm giving up on this. I've got this thing that keeps coming across the screen on here. It's distracting, but never mind. The point I was going to, the point about the channel crossing is that they just don't have the wherewithal to do it. They don't have any landing craft. Their plan has all been about continental power. So suddenly, against the odds, they've done this lightning victory in France. It's been an incredible victory, and the brilliance in which it is enacted is quite exceptional. But you can't just go across the channel. You've got to get your army there. You've got to have control of the airs, command of the skies. They don't have that. They can't get through the channel mines, every night. Fishing boats and trawlers, let alone kind of official naval craft, are going out laying yet more mines in the channel. And every day the kind of Germans are trying to clear them, but they're kind of, it's not working. They just don't have enough barges. The barges they're going to get to transport them are Rhine river barges and the like. And most of those aren't motorized. So what they're planning to do, and this is just makes you realize just how sort of bad and just how hopeless the situation is they're planning to put 3 barges of troops together, each one led by one that has an engine, on a rope will be towed the other 2. Can you imagine? It's just and what happens when they get to the other side? So the one with the engine lands on the beach, and then what do? Sort of pull in the other. There is no answer to this. When Hitler is planning what to do with Britain, because they just haven't thought about this at all. So there is no plan set up before the Battle of France to deal with Britain for cross-channel. There is nothing. You can't just sort of go, oh, we're in Dunkirk now, should we just keep going? It's like, yeah, but with what? It requires planning. That hasn't done beforehand. And one of the reasons they don't is because although with great foresight, Hitler has created the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, which is the first combined arms general staff, he doesn't use it like that. He uses it like his own personal court, his own personal mouthpiece. Keitel and Jodl are basically there to just enact what he says. So he doesn't instruct them to do the kind of planning they ought to be doing. And so what happens is after the fall of France, he goes on a quick sort of tourist guide of trip around Paris, then goes back to Berlin. He goes on a parade. Everyone tells him he's brilliant. And then he goes down to Berchtesgaden, to his house, the Berghof, in the Obersalzberg, and twiddles his thumbs. And, that's like Winston Churchill going to his kind of sort of wood chalet, in the Scottish mountains. It's totally unhelpful. The seat of government is Berlin. That's where everyone is, or at the front. That's where he needs to be. And by turn, he gets the army to come and go, okay, so what's your plan for Operation Sea Lion, for taking over Britain? And they go, okay, well, mein Führer, this is what we think. We think we should attack on a broad front of some 140 miles from Lyme Regis in Dorset to Deal in Kent. Britain's small, but that is, trust me, that's a long bit of coastline. And then the Navy guys come in and they go, well, what we think, Mein Führer, is that, we should land on a very, very narrow corridor because we've got to clear the mines and all the rest of it, and we've got a bit of a problem with shipping. And he goes, okay, fine. And then the Luftwaffe, what do you think? Well, I think we'll just go in and we'll just go and destroy the RAF just like that because we're brilliant. And he goes, okay, fine, well, off you go. There's no combined planning. I mean, just think about Torch or Husky or D-Day. I mean, just think about the kind of levels of planning that go into that and the combined operations, joint effort. It's la la land. I mean, they're living in a kind of sort of fantasy world, and it's just completely bonkers. So actually, the right decision is to finish off France and turn south and go into the middle of France rather than sort of continuing on from Dunkirk, because they simply can't do it. And of course, the Luftwaffe has been designed to support the ground troops. It is designed as a close air support service. That is what it is. It's not there to operate independently. It doesn't have the weight of bombers. The bombers they have are medium bombers. They're really light by 1940 standards. The workhorses is the Dornier 17, the Heinkel 111. They should have had the Junkers 88, but because they insisted on giving it dive bombing capabilities, it's not really ready in big numbers by the middle of 1940. So they're dependent on these bombers and a few Stukas, which were withdrawn pretty quickly from the Battle of Britain because they're being hammered so much, to do the work. And they're just not delivering. So 40 bombers, Battle of Britain style, that would deliver you about 60 tons of bombs. Now, 60 tons of bombs may sound a lot. If 60 tons of bombs fell on here, we'd know about it. But to put that in some perspective, in the 9 weeks leading up to D-Day, Allied bombers dropped 197,000 tons of bombs on France alone. So that tells you the kind of scale.
I'm sorry, we're out of time.
Are we? Oh, well, sorry. But thank you all very much for coming. I should add that I'm very happy to answer any more upstairs if you still got burning questions you want to ask me.